much, Captain. Mr. Stevenson.
Madam Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm here today to discuss GAO's ongoing review of EPA's second program to address indoor contamination from the World Trade Center. Our full report will be issued in September to you. As you know, the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center nearly 6 years ago turned Lower Manhattan into a disastrous site on a scale the nation had never experienced. As the towers collapsed, Lower Manhattan was blanketed in a mixture of building debris and combustible materials that coated building exteriors and streets, as well as the interiors of apartments and offices, exposing thousands of residents and workers to hazards in the air and in the dust, such as asbestos, lead, glass fibers, and pulverized concrete. To put EPA's efforts into perspective, Figure 1 of my statement, you should all have a copy of this, contains a timeline of EPA activities since 9/11. On the day of the attacks, the President signed a major disaster declaration which activated the Federal Government's assistance to state and local agencies. In May 2002, after numerous cleanups, dust collection, and air monitoring activities were conducted outdoors, New York City formally requested Federal assistance to test and clean indoor space in residences and common areas. As shown, EPA implemented the first program to test and clean indoor space about 1 year after the disaster. Residents of Lower Manhattan living south of Canal Street, about 20,000 apartments, were eligible to participate in the program, and about 20%, or 4,100 apartments, did so. However, EPA's first program was severely criticized. In August 2003, as has been mentioned, the EPA's Inspector General complained that the cleanup did not require that entire buildings be systematically cleaned, including HVAC systems, and concluded that the contaminants in uncleaned apartments and common areas could enter the air supply system and recontaminate clean spaces. In March 2004, EPA convened an expert technical review panel to address IG and public concerns about EPA's program. The panel met periodically over 18 months through December of 2005. EPA announced its second program to address indoor contamination in December 2006, over 3 years after completion of the first program, and only 295 of the over 20,000 eligible home and building owners have enrolled, compared to about 4,100 the first time. Madam Chairman, you asked GAO to evaluate EPA's second test and clean program to determine, 1, the extent to which EPA implemented recommendations from the IG, the expert panel, and others; 2, to determine the completeness of information EPA provided to the public about indoor contamination; and 3, to determine how EPA determined that $7 million was the appropriate amount to carry out the program. In summary, we found that EPA incorporated some recommendations into its second indoor air program, but its decision not to adopt others has limited, in our view, the overall effectiveness of the program. EPA did implement recommendations to expand the number of contaminants tested beyond asbestos and did agree to test in dust as well as air. However, it did not incorporate recommendations to expand the boundaries of cleanup beyond Canal Street. EPA reasoned that it would need to identify a World Trade Center signature, that is, a method for differentiating between normal urban dust and World Trade Center dust, to justify expanding the program. But EPA was ultimately never able to identify such a signature, in part because it waited nearly 3 years to attempt to do so. EPA also did not incorporate recommendations to sample in HVACs and inaccessible locations within apartments and common areas, such as behind dishwashers, citing resource constraints. EPA also did not incorporate recommendations to expand the program to include workplaces, stating that worker safety is the responsibility of other agencies. We also found that EPA did not provide sufficient information to allow the public to make informed choices about the extent of contamination and ultimately their participation in the indoor program. For example, EPA publicly reported that a very small number of samples from its first program exceeded risk levels of airborne asbestos. However, it did not adequately explain that this conclusion was based on the fact that most testing was done after cleaning rather than before cleaning. This may have given residents a false sense of security and contributed to the low participation in the second program. Finally, we found no basis for the $7 million EPA identified to implement its second program. It was simply the money left over from the first test and clean program, and it's less than 20% of the first program's funding. EPA chose to limit the scope of the second program to fit within these available resources rather than to design a comprehensive program and then estimate the resources needed to carry it out. EPA told us that if the demand had exceeded available resources, it would have limited participation in the program rather than request additional resources. Madam Chairman, that concludes my summary, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. GAO, because GAO has done a very thorough job in trying to make sense out of many of the contradictory statements and actions that have marked the 9/11 experience. EPA's testimony notes a very low exceedance rate for asbestos in its first indoor test and clean program. Your testimony suggests that EPA used this data in a misleading way. Can you elaborate on this point? And does GAO have any other criticisms about EPA's risk communication after 9/11? Mr. Stevenson.
Well, first you have to remember that the first program, as was the second, was a voluntary program, and air samples were taken largely after the apartments had been cleaned. There was an option for residents to select test only or test and clean. 80% of them, I believe, chose the latter option, to clean first and then test. But you've got to assume that the others who tested only were not sitting around not cleaning their apartments. So our only point was that including that information with any public communication might have been heard differently by residents deciding to participate in the program or not.
Well, let me follow up on that. EPA's December 2006 press release announcing the current test and clean program included the following statement from Dr. George Gray, and I quote, "We believe the potential for exposure related to dust that may remain from the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings is low," end quote. In your judgment, is this statement by Dr. Gray supported by the data that the agency has collected?
Well, EPA has never done a comprehensive assessment of a single building. It's all based on voluntary samples from individual residences. It was done without benefit of looking for dust in HVAC areas, hard to access areas, et cetera. There was an aggressive test approach where they'd go into the apartment and blow the air up, but it wasn't clear which of the samples were done in that manner versus the samples simply taken after clean. So we think the data is quite inconclusive, and we don't think EPA has ever done a comprehensive assessment of the extent of damage in a building, let alone in the lower Manhattan area.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and I think that is the fair conclusion, that EPA has not done a comprehensive study. And I think it's clear that we don't have an accurate base of information.
Reflect, the witnesses have replied in the affirmative. You are now under oath. We will now hear a 5-minute opening statement from our witnesses. You may submit a longer statement for the record and would be included in today's hearing record. Mr. Stevenson, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Walden. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the quality and safety of bottled water and its environmental impacts. Over the past decade, the per capita consumption of bottled water in the United States has more than doubled from 13.4 gallons per person in 1997 to 29.3 gallons per person in 2007. That's over 200 bottles a year for every man, woman, and child, and an $11+ billion market. With this increase have come several questions and concerns over bottled water's quality and safety. My testimony is based on the report that we're issuing to the committee today, which is going to be publicly released. In summary, we found that FDA safety and consumer protections are less stringent for bottled water than comparable EPA protections for tap water. While FDA standards for bottled water generally mirror the standards for nearly all of the 88 contaminants covered by EPA's National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, there is one notable exception, DEHP, which is a plasticizer used to soften plastic, which has been linked to reproductive and liver problems and increased cancer risk. And it has been regulated by the EPA in tap water since 1992, but FDA deferred action on DEHP in a final rule published in 1996 and has yet to either adopt a standard or publish a reason for not doing so, even though the statutory deadline for acting was more than 15 years ago. Since DEHP is used in food packaging as well as bottled water, This is a broader issue that FDA is still studying. Nevertheless, our report recommends that FDA expeditiously promulgate a DEPH standard for bottled water. More broadly, we found that FDA, unlike EPA, does not have the statutory authority to require bottlers to use certified laboratories for water quality tests or to report test results, even if violations of the standards are found. Most tests are done by the bottlers themselves. Several states have requirements to safeguard bottled water that exceed those of FDA, but are still less comprehensive than for tap water. In addition, while FDA bottled water labeling requirements are similar to labeling requirements for other foods, they provide consumers with far less information about the source and quality of water than what EPA requires of public water systems under the Safe Drinking Water Act. For example, public water systems must annually provide consumer confidence reports that summarize water quality information about the water's sources, detected contaminants, and compliance with national primary drinking water regulations, as well as information on the potential health effects of certain contaminants. FDA does not require bottled water companies to provide similar information. In a study mandated by the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act, FDA concluded that it was feasible for the bottled water industry to provide the same type of information to consumers that public water systems must provide. However, the agency was not required to act on its findings and is yet to do so. Our survey of 50 states in the District of Columbia showed that consumers have misconceptions about bottled water, believing that it is safer and healthier than tap water. We also found that information comparable to what public water systems are required to provide to consumers of tap water was available for only a small percentage of the 83 bottled water labels we examined, companies we contacted, or company websites we reviewed. We believe that consumers would benefit from better information on the quality and safety of bottled water, and our report also recommends that FDA implement the results of its study to accomplish this. In examining the environmental effects of bottled water, we found that only about 25% of water bottles are recycled and that the remaining 75% are discarded to municipal landfills where they never decompose and essentially remain forever. While this over 900,000 tons of plastic annually, it represents less than 1% of municipal waste. Another issue is the amount of energy used to manufacture and transport bottled water. Another study estimates the energy used at 5.8 megajoules per liter. At the current rate of consumption, this is the equivalent of the energy used by 4.7 million households for a year, and is 1,000 to 2,000 times the energy used for tap water. We also found that groundwater extraction for bottled water facilities in selected areas and that Michigan and other states have passed laws to minimize the impact of stream levels and wetlands. Finally, I would note that some of our bottled water findings are indicative of FDA's overall food safety oversight problems that led to GAO's designating it a high-risk area in January 2007 and again in 2009, when we called for a fundamental reexamination of the federal food safety system. We believe that FDA's lack of authority and resources to effectively regulate bottled water should be part of that reexamination. Mr. Chairman, that concludes a summary of my statement, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Dr. Sharfstein, would you like to open